Our final main session of the Global Forum looks at two very significant pieces of work undertaken by businesses on how best practice requires guidance and training. And this session's led by my IHRB colleague, Carmen Pedraza. Over to you, Carmen.
Thank you, Neil. So, as Neil mentioned, my name is Carmen Pedraza. I am part of the IHRB family, which means that not only my direct manager, Neil Wilkins, but also my CEO is here, which means that I should be nervous also, but I'm okay. I'm okay. Yeah, it's true. But I'm okay. And well, we're almost the last session of the forum. So I am gonna try to make it as engaging as possible. And for that, I need to start with a disclaimer with the fact that I am Mexican, which means that my mother language is not English. So I'm sorry in advance if I make any grammatical mistakes. Also, because Mexican Spanish, if you know any Mexican, is basically slang Spanish. So I have to slang the Spanish and then translate the slang and make it professional. So I had to put that out there as a disclaimer. But yes, also a couple of reminders. Please do drop your questions as soon as possible to the panelists. I'm going to be receiving them directly. I ask our technical team to send me the questions directly to my cell phone, talking about data-driven solutions. So the sooner you send them, the sooner I get to understand them, translate them in my head, and also pose them to our panelists during the Q&A section. And also, we're going to be talking, as Neil mentioned, about initiatives. Those initiatives, rest assured, are going to be easy to find in the dedicated online platform, where you are also going to be able to drop the questions. You can find them in the profiles of our speakers. So please do go in and have a look, because we're going to be talking about them. But well, so I am part of the IHRB family, as I mentioned. I am the communications officer of the Migrant Workers Program and also the point of contact for the North American region, which means that this is not my first global forum. This is not my first rodeo, though it's my first one on stage. I hope it's not the last one. It's my fourth global forum, and it's also not the first global forum of my fellow panelists. Leanne Melnick from Quizart, and also Henriette, with, I'm sorry to make this joke, Henriette, with the coolest surname you're ever gonna listen, which is Henriette McCool from Vinci. And we are gonna be talking about the effectiveness of worker-centric training. But for that, and I mean, we had a conversation before this, because it's almost the last session of the forum, we're gonna need your help to frame the conversation. So we're gonna ask for your help, as I mentioned, and also for the help of the online audience, but I'm not gonna direct this dynamic. The brave one to do that is gonna be Leanne here. So take it away, please, Leanne.
Okay, so we're gonna get everyone moving, because I think we've been sitting for a long time. So what we're gonna do is just start off by anyone who has actually focused or invested in or participated in training workers in global supply chains, please stand up. Okay. Ooh, that's actually quite a few of us here. So for those of you that are joining online, hopefully you can see there's quite a few people standing. Okay, so next, stay standing if you've in some way measured the effectiveness of your training. So that could be measuring the number of people trained. It could mean measuring knowledge gain. Okay, still quite a few people standing. Next, stay standing if you've used mixed methods, so qualitative and quantitative ways to measure the effectiveness of your training of workers in global supply chains. Great. Well, we have actually lots of people here that have actually measured the effectiveness of training workers in global supply chains. So I'm excited to connect with all of you afterwards to discuss this topic. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Leanne. Very smart strategic way to start a panel, right, on worker-centric training. So I drafted a couple of questions to disclose or to go in deep into the initiatives that Quasar and Vinci are going to talk about. But I decided to start from the beginning, though it's almost the last session and a lot of people already know Quasar and Vinci. I'm assuming not a lot of people, not everyone in the room, and also not everyone online, because we have a big audience online. So the first question is actually a quick intro. I'm going to ask you two to please give us a snapshot of Vinci and Quasar. And can we get the first slide, please? There you go.
Okay, this is my slide. So hello, everyone. My name is Leanne. I lead program and partnerships at Quasar. So we are a Sweden-based edtech company, and our focus is really on training workers in global supply chains, but also all of those other key stakeholders around workers. So those would be supplier management. In the context of responsible recruitment, it's also looking at training recruitment agencies or labor brokers. And it's also increasingly looking at training buyers as well. So we talked a lot this week about training procurement teams to actually understand responsible purchasing practices as well. So we've trained to date, we're getting pretty close to 1 million workers, which is amazing. So huge thank you to Working Capital, which we're one of the Working Capital companies. And when we started, I'm pretty sure we weren't there at that number. So we really focus on scale. But you'll also notice that we work in 48 different markets and we have training in 47 different languages. So we really focus on reaching workers in a language that they understand, tackling some of those workplaces where you could have workers from many different nationalities. We train on many different topics, but the one that I'm going to be focusing on today is on our ethical employment or responsible recruitment training. And we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the work that we're doing with different companies, training workers in global supply chains, but really with a focus on how do you actually measure the impact of that training that you're doing together with workers. Thanks.
What about Vinci?
Oh, nice to see you all. Henriette Mecou from Vinci. I manage social responsibility and human rights for a global player in construction, concessions, and energy. We have about 285,000 employees and operate in 120 countries.
Okay, big players on stage. Now that we have an idea of, the magnitude, the size of both Vinci and Quasar, let's talk about, or let's introduce you to the initiative that you would like to share today with the forum. So to start, can each of you briefly describe the initiative you'll be referring to today? What was the main objective of the initiative and how did it start?
So I think we can go to the slides again. Yeah, there we go. So our journey actually started in Bangladesh in around 2013. And our founder's story is quite interesting. So she actually followed her husband to Bangladesh. I think he worked for H&M at the time. And Sophie, our founder, was responsible for doing the traveling puppet theaters. So going from factory to factory and teaching workers about their rights through these little puppet theaters. And the workers loved it because it was talking about rights, but through the narrative of storytelling. So making it fun for workers to engage in and really making it memorable. And then we realized that that wasn't necessarily the most scalable form of teaching workers about their rights. And so the idea was born of, could we have this traveling puppet theater, but in this digital format so that we could reach workers all over the globe? And that's really when we started. And then kind of through this came the idea of data. And I think we've been talking a lot about data over the past little bit. And so it's not just about the training app that we have. And the training app is what we call sort of low tech, very easy, accessible for the workers to access. But at the back end, generating actionable data for suppliers, for brands, really giving them insights into where some of those different risks may be in the workplace, and helping them to have a reflection of what workers and management know in their supply chains on different topics. So between these two different parts of our training, the training app as well as the dashboard, we have different parts to it. Like we make it gamified and fun. And I think we can go on to the next slide. And this is just to show that the other part that we've really focused on is trying to make sure that training is relevant for workers in the workplace. So this is actually the same training program. So this is our ethical employment or responsible recruitment training program, but the same variation of it in 4 different markets. And so we always try to have this combination of live action films or storytelling with animation and quiz questions rolled up into one program. And we're going to be talking about this again a little bit later on about the challenges. But the idea here is to really not just have a global training program, but to localize the content so that it's relevant and fun for the workers to engage in. Aside from this, the thing that we're going to be talking about today is how we scaled with different clients and how ultimately, as we've been rolling out training year on year and growing in different markets, a lot of brands now are asking for some sort of impact measurement to go alongside the training. And that wasn't there before. I think earlier on, it was sort of a bit of a niche thing for brands to say, hey, I don't want to just train, but I want to measure the effectiveness of this training. But I think what's been happening since CSDDD and some of the other legislation has come down the pipeline is that we have this step 4 now in the OECD framework, which is really about tracking and monitoring effectiveness. And so I think now that it's really enshrined in the HRDD process, there's a lot more of a focus on it. And so what we're going to be talking about today in a little bit is about some collaborative work that we did together with Apple as well as with Unilever around measuring the impact of worker training, looking both at effectiveness, but also the longer term impact of the training. Thanks.
Thank you, Leanne. I like what you said about storytelling. For me, as a communications expert, I don't know if anyone there also, it reminded me a lot of a saying in communications, which in Spanish, it says, el medio es el mensaje, which I think can be translated to the medium, or the media is the message, and how sometimes how you deliver something is more important than what you are delivering. But what about Vansi?
So the initiative I'm delighted to share with you about today is the e-course Fair Recruitment Toolkit in Practice. Its main objective, so here's just a snapshot of the Fair Recruitment Toolkit that I presented at the Global Forum last year in London. Its main objective is to make fair recruitment tools as accessible as possible to as many companies as possible. And beyond all the existing guidance, we thought about developing some tools for practitioners, some tools that were missing. I'll just give a couple of examples. If you don't know what a fair recruitment policy looks like, you can download one with the toolkit. If you want to know if a recruitment agency is actually implementing fair recruitment or if it's just lip service, we propose a recruitment agency inspection checklist that you can use. If you suspect that one of your suppliers has workers in situation of bonded labor, for example, we've also proposed a workers' recruitment fee interview form. Along with, there's a total of 13 tools, and we're not reinventing the wheel, we're also quoting existing tools. But we felt that for companies and their suppliers and their providers, some very practical tools were missing, and this is what we made possible in this toolkit. It has 3 main characteristics. It's sector agnostic, it's open source, and it's been tested based on our experience in the past decade. And what's new this year, and what I'm delighted to share with you, is the e-course that has just been published a few months ago. We can go back to the previous slide, please. Yeah, we developed it We launched it in Feb under the WBCSD Academy platform. Like the toolkit, it's open source. So we decided to make it available and free for whoever needs it. The target audience remains the same. It's for employers and their suppliers. It's for operational teams. It's for HR practitioners, sustainability teams, contracts, etc. It takes about 30 minutes to complete. And we can go to the next slide, please. And each tool and each chapter, we remind the key principles and explanation, why the tool is useful, who the key implementers are, either in the company or in the supply chain, and what action can be implemented. Well, you all know what an e-learning is, so I'm not going to spend ages about it, but we try to make it as digest and interactive as possible with some knowledge checks, etc. Up until now, we had organized some regional capacity building workshop around the toolkit. We have trained 35 people in Dubai last year, and we'll train 30 more tomorrow in Bangkok, Vinci subsidiaries and WBCSD members. And so up until now, it was only a happy few, which could have access to how to deploy these tools. And so the e-course is now to sort of reach scale and make it a lot more bigger.
Thank you.
And about how, where it came from, we can move on to the next slide, please. This toolkit and this e-course did not come out of the blue. With my colleague Nal here in the room, we tried to represent it under a theory of change diagram. And I'd say that the first inputs and first activities which went into it was workers' interviews, hence the worker-centric aspect of our training. It was reinforced due diligence in our recruitment processes for our direct workers, but also audits in our supply chain. The fair recruitment principle is the first chapter of the Vinci Guide on Human Rights. So that was another thing that we developed as an initial activity. And we did this pilot project in the construction sector with the ILO. And the immediate outputs was a better understanding of the gaps that were existing. And that's why we developed the tools. Also, the acknowledgement that we needed to work with peers. And this toolkit is a collaborative tool. It's not just Vinci, it's with a number of companies, including Unilever. And now the e-course and the regional capacity workshop. In terms of immediate outcomes, the training has allowed our subsidiaries to make a lot more direct alerts. So it kind of works that way. We've, along the process, increased our awareness in various migration corridors. We've seen an increased implementation of both prevention and remediation measures and some policy reforms. And even though it's very difficult to put exact numbers on it, we know that we're reaching some impact by decreasing workers' debt, risks of forced labor, by increasing work productivity and retention, and hopefully by creating more transparent and sustainable supply chain, even though it's still a big challenge.
Well, now, but really relevant indicators, I would say. Thank you, Henriette. My next question is, now that we have an idea of how these initiatives work and who are they touching and how also, the next question is, building partnerships with major buyers or suppliers has to impact the way worker-centric models are implemented. How was the initiative co-developed or adapted in partnership with workers, and what role did suppliers and buyers play in making it effective?
I think the last panel that we were just listening to brought up a number of points that are actually quite relevant to this conversation. So some of the ones that kind of stood out in my head was, when the worker said, I don't understand why this company cares about me. And looking at the trust factor that is often there. Or the quote, they never knew there was an avenue to raise their voice. And I think these are some of the decent work deficits that we're really trying to address by really tackling the worker element, which is really, I think, an underserved market in capacity building in global supply chains. So when we build the training, really the worker element is sort of that primary audience that we've had in mind. And I think we don't always have resources to go out and do thousands and thousands of surveys with workers to get their inputs. But sometimes we do. And I think a really good example of that is some recent work that we've been doing with Rainforest Alliance, building our programs in agriculture, where we did actually have the opportunities to go out and interview workers that were actually working in these sectors to find out what were the issues that they were facing. What did they want to see in a training program? And it was really, really valuable, actually, the insights that we got back from that. Not only because we realized actually the target audience that we thought was there was not actually the audience. Where we thought there would be a lot of migrant workers, for instance, in the coffee sector in these regions that we were focusing on in Mexico, it was actually a lot of indigenous workers. And we found out that there was a huge proportion of older women migrant workers who didn't speak Spanish. And when we went in, we're like, oh, we'll just translate it into Spanish and it will all be good. And it turned out, actually, that wasn't the case. We had to translate things into Nahuatl and Tzotzil as well. So that's an example of how sort of that direct engagement with workers and actually getting their inputs for the training program can actually help to make it a lot more effective. But I think the other thing that I just want to say about engaging with different stakeholders, aside from the worker audience, is that if we look at recruitment, it's a complex process and it involves a lot of different actors. And I think when we look at training around responsible recruitment, one of the biggest mistakes that's constantly being made is that we focus on training one or two stakeholders in that process. And I think for things to change, and we're going to discuss this a little bit more when we get to the sort of what were the findings of what was effective in the training, is that you do need to focus on this ecosystem approach for training. We really need to focus on training every single one of those key stakeholders that's part of that recruitment process. And just make sure that you're not just focusing on management and hoping that it's going to trickle down to the workers.
I love the example, and I love that we're talking on Mexico, of course. No, but honestly, I'm writing down that it's interesting in this specific example how engaging with vulnerable communities, it's already triggering a systemic change because it's a debate in the country, for those who don't know, the importance of or the challenge of keeping alive the indigenous languages like Nahuatl. And in this case, it's not only keeping it alive, it's like, recognizing its value in an economy that does not recognize it. So I love the example. Thank you, Quisar, for that. But what about Vinci? What was when building the partnerships with major buyers or suppliers, how did it impact the initiative?
Well, first on the worker-centric aspect, what led our initial tools was a large-scale worker survey that was done more than 10 years ago in Qatar on the light metro project site, where we interviewed 180 workers, so about 15% of the total population of migrant workers on site at the time, focusing on many social, economic aspects, but also a lot on recruitment. So it's this type of exercises which led us then to develop these tools. And the following year, we reiterated those interviews with 1,200 workers after a recruitment drive. 2 years after, we did the same thing with 540. We did another large-scale one with 300 workers in the UAE. Recently, we've been doing some in Saudi, and we've started to do some in Southeast Asia as well. And as part of the ILO pilot project, where another 340 workers were interviewed thoroughly, and where the workers' interviews were done by third parties, including Verité and the Fair Hiring Initiative and Tufts University, actually the majority of those workers' interviews have been conducted by a local team of CSR officers or human rights officers who were sort of living and spending a lot of time on site, working on site, so knowing the workers and creating the trust element of the relationship, and who could conduct the interviews in the native languages. So it's not my profession today, but I have a background in social anthropology. And I think that a lot of what we do has commonalities with the ethnographic method of participant observation, of immersion, of fieldwork. And ethnography is field-based research, trying to give some, to derive meaning from lived experiences. And it's based on the assumption that personal engagement with the participants is actually key to understanding some social and cultural phenomenon. And here the social phenomenon is migration and forced labor. And this is really at the basis of what we do as human rights practitioner. So that would be for the worker-centric approach. As for the impact and the input from buyers and suppliers, I would say that they've been instrumental. Well, on the buyer side and client side, let's say that it's been limited. But on the supplier side, I'll give one illustration with the ILO pilot project, where actually one of the key success factors that we identified was that we had everybody from the recruitment chain in the same room working together for 2 years. So the Qatar Ministry of Labor, the ILO, Vinci and QDVC as the main contractor. But the key stakeholders were STS, our major manpower provider, and their own recruitment agency, Bonanza Overseas, in Bangladesh, to work on the Bangladesh to Qatar corridor. And their inputs have been tremendous. I mean, it's thanks to them that we understood the nitty-gritty details of how recruitment drives work. It's thanks to them that we understood what type of incentives the sub-agents needed, what type of incentives that they themselves needed to change their business model, and the type of messages that the workers needed to hear in order to trust the system, to ask for information, and to use the grievance mechanisms. So kudos to them, and please reach out to them when you can.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a good segue to my next question, which is in developing your initiatives, the ones you have been sharing, what mechanisms ensure that workers' voices were not just included, but actually drove design and implementation? And I'm asking if you have some specific examples of this.
So we actually incorporate, I guess just in terms of the training app itself, it was designed to have, so we dub all of our films and it's voice enabled as well. So that even if you're a worker that can't necessarily read, you can still access the training. So I think there's a lot of very practical worker-centric features that were built into that whole design process for the training itself. But I think in addition to that, we've recently started adding instant feedback questions into each one of the training processes. So we ask the workers at the end of the training, did you enjoy this training? Did you learn something new? Do you plan to use this with family and friends? So just try to solicit feedback on the training itself with the direct users. But I think there's also I think the biggest thing with workers is to really focus on making sure that they understand the why element behind the training. And again, this goes back to the storytelling element and really making sure that we're developing materials that are not sort of a one audience speaks all, but understanding what these issues mean to the workers directly. And I think, again, this was raised as a point in the last session about why it's important to report grievances. Why is it important to raise things proactively? And so in our films, we really try to have that why element be a central part of it. So for responsible recruitment, for instance, we focus on specific topics like, why is it important to understand that taking leave is your right? Why is it important to understand that you shouldn't be forced to do overtime? Why is it important to proactively raise issues? So really helping to understand the worker's particular position within this training program.
Thank you. What about Vinci?
In terms of workers' mechanisms, mechanisms to ensure worker voices were included. I'll just give a few examples. Once again, as part of the pilot project, the recruitment agency and manpower provider just created some WhatsApp group, which made like a direct channel of communication with the group of candidates. And also organized some Skype or Visio session between groups of candidates about to migrate with people who were already in the Gulf without management supervision, so that they could exchange and share about concerns and ask any question that they wanted to. And I'd say a word as well about Vince's approach to social dialogue and the fact that we've had workers' committees and elected workers' committees for a long time, including in sensitive region, where worker voices is not always encouraged. And the fact that when we engage on this ethical recruitment journey, it led us to meet like actors like IHRB. We joined the leadership group for responsible recruitment. It made us meet with UN agencies, with NGOs. We signed an agreement with BWI. And so all those forums represent workers' voices as well. And so I think that we took a lot of inputs from the research, the advice, all the conversation and engagement we had with these actors.
I love the example of the WhatsApp group. It reminds me of, when you are in your young years, an exchange student, and you need the support.
I didn't have
of
WhatsApp
this.
as a student.
I was going to say these Facebook groups, that's the case of us millennials. I don't know if your case, John, was it like sending a written letter? I don't know. With
Pigeons.
a flying pigeon. Yeah, of course. But I mean, I think, it's me putting I think it highlights the importance of, our capacity to put ourselves in this place. How would I feel if I were going abroad to work? I would love to talk to someone directly through a WhatsApp group or Facebook group in my case, or pigeons in some other cases. Yeah, when going abroad, it's a really nice example. My next question is, and I think this one could be a challenging question to all of us here, when trying to talk about impact of human rights and business, which is, what does effectiveness mean in the context of worker-centric training? Which indicators or outcomes do you prioritize when evaluating success? How was the process for defining those indicators? Like, could you share some of your experiences on that?
Yeah, I always get a little bit nervous when I get forced into conversations with some of the companies that we're working with to talk about impact, because everyone has such a different view on what that actually means. So I've realized that for some people, impact is really about, is there knowledge change? Is it the number of people trained? Other people want to know that there's like some productivity gains or something on the business side that comes from the training. Other people really just want to focus on audit scores. Is there an improvement in audit scores? So there's really a lot of different ways that people are looking at the objective of the training. And so that's one thing I've realized, is to make it clear from the start about what somebody wants to get out of the training, and also helping to align those expectations that maybe it's not the best goal to have, is to have an improvement in an audit score as being the outcome for a training. Maybe it's really about focusing on some of these more meaningful indicators that we like to measure. But what are those? So it's definitely been a journey of discovery for indicators and figuring out what should be coming out of a training. And so we started off by having this sort of rough idea of what we thought would come out of a responsible recruitment training. So we actually started off with a very large whiteboard, and just started etching out this theory of change with different levels, and what are all the possible outcomes that we could think coming out of this training. And there were sort of these bigger impacts, like things around worker satisfaction. So I think, actually, you know what, we used the working capital theory of change as the starting point, because it was one of the better ones that I had seen. And we started thinking about, what are these decent work outcomes for workers? Could it be that they have improvements in working conditions? But what would lead into that? And looking at things like, maybe we should see an increase in the number of grievances that workers are submitting, because as you build trust, as you build accountability, then they feel more secure to share those. So increase in grievances was one of them. looking at, but it was sort of in the middle. It was the middle that was the murkiest. And that was sort of the black hole that we went into with this training in this impact sort of journey that we were on. And that was really the one that I think was the most surprising part. And one of the most important indicators that I've seen come out of it, which is in the middle, is actually around generative dialogue, and really having this sort of shared understanding in the workplace between workers, managers, labor agents, having that shared understanding be a strong pathway for discussion on what's going well and what's not going well in the workplace, and really talking about what's right and wrong and kind of driving that accountability. So yeah, whiteboarding and generative dialogue would be my two answers to that.
What about Vinci?
So I'd say we probably don't look enough into trying to measure the effectiveness of our training, but for the panel, we made the exercise. I'd say that more globally on fair recruitment, the ultimate indicator for us is the zero recruitment fee and the employer pays principle, which is not that easy to calculate, especially to have visibility over our supply chain. It's not something that we're able to do currently or to publish. It's not really the goal. So the first foundation of effectiveness for us is really around awareness, hence the training and different types of training. And it would be awareness of the candidates, of the workers, but also HR teams and the people who will be the guarantors of a fair recruitment process. I don't know if we can share some slides.
Yeah,
please. Yes. I've tried to put some indicators together to sort of measure our action around fair recruitment. It all started because of you, Leanne, because when I found out that Quasar had trained close to 1 million workers, I felt that I would be a bit ridiculous with my 65 participants with a capacity building workshop. So taking a sort of more bird's eye view on what Vinci has done since the sort of start of the ethical recruitment journey, we've actually done a little bit with close to, it's an estimation, but we've interviewed close to 3,500 workers. More than 80% of them are migrant workers. And Vinci has mainly local workers. I mean, I think that the migrant workers are a tiny minority of our global workforce, but still, because it's a silent human rights issue, we decided to invest some time and resources on it. And as part of our general human rights e-learning that's open to all our employees, 1 chapter out of 5 is on fair recruitment. And we've trained 45,000 people. And it's not easy to measure and to calculate the impact, but we've done lots of engagement with collaborative initiatives, including the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment. We did a whole series of webinars with Building Responsibly last year, and lots of bilateral calls. And obviously, engaging with subcontractors is a big aspect of the work around fair recruitment. So again, we estimate that to be a few hundreds. And now if we zoom in a little bit more into the impact measurement of the capacity building training that we've done, we've tried that exercise, and we can move to the next slide, please. So we did the initial first regional workshop last year, did a follow-up session, and this year, a year after, we did an impact assessment survey. So I don't know how representative it is because the number of companies participating is limited, but we were able to compare their practices at the time of the workshop with 1 year after, and the results are positive in the sense that now 100% of the companies participating to that workshop now abide by the employer pays principle. So that's +7 points compared to last year. 2/3 of the companies have set in place processes to investigate whether recruitment fees have been paid, +20 points. Huge increase as well in the number of proactive audits with recruitment agencies, suppliers, etc. And perhaps not surprising, an area of progress is around grievance mechanism and remedy, where the company's grievance mechanism do not necessarily cover suppliers' workers. And actually 35% have received recruitment fees related grievances. So our grievance mechanisms are used for other types of issue, not recruitment fees. So we know by experience that you have to actively interview the workers specifically on recruitment to get that information. It wouldn't be spontaneous from them. And yeah, still a low increase into the way that we handle those grievances.
Thank you for sharing. I'm sorry to ask this quick question, but can we bring back the slide just 1 second? Because I'm curious still about the plus 20 points. Like, can you just quickly explain us, like what are these basically?
Why we reached that increase?
Or why the grading system?
Because we just brainwashed them during the training.
So what does it represent? Like 1 point, 20 points?
So it means that during the workshop last year, so it was 47% of companies who had put in place investigation devices to interview their workers, and that reached 67% this year. So that's an increase of 20 points.
Okay.
So it's just an increase in the
percentage. Okay, no, very clear. I do have to rescue from what you were saying, or something that I really like is how, we have to recognize how Vinci is focusing on a small part of its workforce because it is it's most vulnerable also, and how that, I wrote down focusing in the most vulnerable is a good pinch point for improving a system as a whole. It's something that I think has to be recognized of Vinci. My next question is, what are some of the key challenges you face in aligning the expectations of partners, suppliers, clients with the realities of workers?
Sorry, actually, if we can go back one question, which was like, can you share examples of the measurable change? You probably said that in the last one and I just missed it. But maybe if there should be a slide in there,
Yes,
which should have some examples of changes. Yes, that's the one. Thanks. So this is a really important slide. And this is actually the work that we did together with Apple on measuring change around their responsible recruitment training. So Apple has some pretty serious and stringent standards in place on responsible recruitment. And we're one of the partners that they work with to train labor agents, workers, managers, and their supply chains. And as they've been working for several years on this topic, understandably, they wanted to understand what was the actual impact of this training. And so what this slide shows is some of those different pathways to impact that were identified. So kind of starting off at the top, and maybe just to say that we did this research over 2 different sites, which you think it's just 2 sites, but actually that represents 20,000 workers, managers, labor agents, line supervisors. So there was a lot of people that were involved in the training at these 2 big sites. And what we found was that when we interviewed workers who had taken the training a year previously, that they had 90 to 98% knowledge retention on the training materials, which is pretty good, right? Like, I feel like I don't even remember what happened like yesterday, but it's been a year and these workers still really remembered the live action, like the storytelling, again, the narrative that was still there in their head that helped them to remember some of these key principles that they learned a year previously. And then the other one was a much more sort of nuanced understanding on forced labor. So even though these were great sites, they already knew a lot about forced labor, having that sort of that deeper understanding, more technical understanding of the topic that was shared between all of these different groups provided that very sort of foundation for having that dialogue between workers and managers. And that dialogue then led to this behavioral change. So what we saw was greater empathy between managers and workers. what we saw was that workers also told us that they were more diligent in reading contracts. Labor agents also told us that they were more diligent in reminding new recruits to actually go ahead and read their contracts carefully. Workers were more confident in speaking up about issues to their managers and labor agents. And I think that behavioral change is really important also because it just shows the engagement with the training and sort of the readiness for change on these topics. And then we also saw labor agents incorporating the learnings into their own onboarding training. And again, really just reminding people as they're signing their contracts of the zero fee policy. And also managers, as I said, just being more empathetic with workers. So there was multiple examples of managers listening to workers more. And I think those were, again, what I spoke about earlier about this murky in-between of what comes after knowledge change, but what comes before, let's say, real sort of massive changes around zero fees. That for me is sort of the most important part that we need to look forward to is this sort of empathy between workers and managers, this generative dialogue and this communication that's happening, which is taking the training and putting it into practice.
On that point, sorry if
Yeah,
I can
go for it.
interrupt. During our capacity building workshop around the Fair Recruitment Toolkit, we organized some role play where the participants have to put themselves in the shoes of a migrant worker, or they have to sort of audit a recruitment agency, or try and triangulate the information. I think that really changes their perspective. It's the role plays and storytelling aspect, I think it works.
And then we also saw business benefits, which was great too. So I think it was pretty amazing to see how labor agents had reported increased job applications for sites. So we saw this sort of increased popularity for these sites that had the employer pays principle in place. And then we also saw, and I think on the Unilever side as well, there was some, for the Unilever study, we were actually looking at gender, which is why I haven't presented it today, but there was some really, really interesting business benefits that came along with gender equality that I think we wouldn't have known at the very start of the training had we not gone back and done these interviews with workers and managers after the training concluded. And then also seeing just how much workers were actually taking the training and going out and sharing it with family and friends. So seeing this sort of ripple effect beyond the workplace. And I'm going to leave that last quote for afterwards when we talk about the challenges. But I think these were some amazing findings just to see that, yeah, we're not just doing training for training's sake, but we're seeing real sort of impact on the ground.
I have to say, you are starting to touch on some of the questions from the audience, but I'm still going to save those for the Q&A because people are interested into knowing, the challenges, yes, the impact of these generative dialogues, how to measure it, but you are touching on it, basically. But yeah, going back to then my next question is, what are some of the key challenges you face in aligning the expectations of partners, suppliers, or clients with the realities of workers?
I'll go quick on this one, but I see a few key challenges still. I'd say the first one is discrepancy between the general consensus around employer pays principle that comes from our investors community, from civil society, a little bit less from our clients, especially in certain regions where we operate. So there's still the discrepancy. I'd say that remediation is still a key challenge. I don't know if it's part of the lived reality of worker, in the sense that I don't know if our migrant workers expect remediation. I think that they're happy to sort of confide and tell their stories without necessarily expecting reimbursement. And on reimbursement, in the case of the construction sector, once again, I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself, but there's such a challenge into putting some enforcement mechanisms in place on fast-paced projects, which are cyclical, where our temporary labor are here only for a few months on site, where we don't necessarily have a lot of leverage. And so we try to push for the impact repayment standards. It's part of our training. We talk about it, we push internally, but it's not working yet. So unless it's really anticipated, unless we put in place some contingency fund from the start, unless recruitment fees are budgeted early in advance, it's difficult to implement.
Yeah, I can imagine. My next question is, how do you mitigate the risk of worker-centered initiatives becoming top-down in practice?
Maybe I'll just touch quickly on a challenge and then I'll hand it over to you. I was going to say that the biggest challenge that we face is really around that constant tension that there is between creating locally relevant material and the need for scale. It's so much harder than you would think to actually do it in practice for so many different countries. Also because when we take a topic like forced labor or even responsible recruitment, it looks so different depending on the context. And so constantly trying to update your material, like we've been hearing today a lot about what's happening in Myanmar and how that quickly changed the dynamics, and about how the sort of suspension of the MOU process, like those are all really, really important dynamics that are happening right here in this particular region. And so being able to reflect a lot of those important aspects that are there at the local level in the training and still allow it to be scalable at the global level. So being able to go to a brand who operates in 50 different countries and be like, yeah, we've got your training program for all 50 countries. That's a really hard, or one of the hardest challenges I think we have as a company, is to be able to have that sort of global coverage while still have programs be really meaningful and impactful to workers.
On the risk of a top-down approach, I'd say I don't really see a risk. We had an interesting exercise last week in Riyadh, in Saudi, where some French company, a small group of motivated French companies gathered at the French embassy to talk about worker welfare and human rights. And IHRB participated. Thank you again. There was actually a consensus around the fact that our approach should be worker-centered. And on the contrary, I would say that, and I don't see the risk within Vinci of us losing that aspect, but I would say I would want more top-down approach, in the sense that I would want our clients to make the EPP auditable and audited, to sort of, reach alignment and a level playing field.
Okay. Next question, and I can see that more are dropping from the audience. For others in the room hoping to replicate your model, what foundational elements must be in place to scale these initiatives, or these kind of initiatives?
Okay. Foundational elements. First one would be sharing information about what works, what doesn't, who the responsible actors are. And we're quite excited at Vinci to have joined the project described by Impact yesterday on the recruitment fee risk map. We're happy to share information that we've gathered over the years. So first one would be sharing information. Another foundational element would be coherence. And by coherence, I mean coherence between our guiding principles and our commercial practices. I mean, we often complain that there's no level playing field, that our efforts into human rights are not recognized by our clients, but do we create the system in which our suppliers can themselves have responsible practices rather than just going for the lowest bidder? And the third one would be, it's a classic one, but it would be alignment. And so over the years, over my 13 years at Vinci, I've never encountered anyone who was against the EPP or who was happy that workers were paying. What I've seen is people, projects under immense pressure, sort of contradicting requirements between wanting to do well but not really believing they can change the system, and huge pressure from the client on delivering on time and within budget. And so I think that it's really important to keep that coherence internally as well.
I think you just described the essence of the complexities of systemic change or managing it, but also the need to gain ownership on what's our role when changing that system. What about Quisser?
I think one of the first things is really, as I said, like figure out what your objective is at the start. Don't just train for the sake of training because it's like the easy thing to do under the prevention bucket. Really think about why you're training, who you're training, what you're training them for, and make sure that the training that you're trying to do is really addressing, again, the complexity of the recruitment system, and that you're thinking about all of those key actors that need to be involved in it. So really taking that ecosystem approach. And then also thinking about what are those different supportive elements that you need in place. Because I think a lot of people put trainings out there, but then there's no one to really sort of manage and drive them. And that's, I remember one time when I worked at Li and Fung, which is a company in Hong Kong, and we created this modern slavery training. And then I don't know how I became responsible for it, but I became responsible for sort of driving it. And I remember I spent so much time following up with people, poring over Excel lists over who had not done the training, who had done the training. I emailed managers. I like followed up with them daily. It was like my full-time job was.
For them.
We can sympathize. Like we can have a drink later over it tonight about this process. Like it takes a lot of work to roll it out. So make sure that you have your rollout plan in place, and that you have someone who's like very persistent to drive that. And then finally, think about impact from the start. So don't think, I mean, it's okay to think about it after the fact. Like we probably thought about it more after the fact, but it's good to really understand from the start, how are you actually collecting this data? Does your system have the right sort of mechanisms in place to actually track that data? What are you trying to track? So to really think about what you're trying to get out of it and how you're actually measuring it would be my advice.
Thank you. I'm having a look at the watch, yeah, and we are down. I mean, we have very limited minutes, but we're also down to the last question I drafted, but I want to be a bit democratic, at least with the time, and kind of pack them with some of the questions that we've been receiving. So my last question was, if there's one message you want companies or recruitment agencies to take away from your experience, what would it be? And I mean, well, you tell me or not, but and a question from the audience is that I think can be linked is different companies see impact in different ways. Some may follow ethical hiring practices, but still focus only on profit, not employee satisfaction. How can we help them see the value of keeping employees happy and encourage them to care about both? Yeah, I mean, I throw you both. You can choose which one to answer to focus.
I'll take the one message to give.
That's good.
It would be 3 quick messages. First one would be continue to invest resources into human rights and ethical recruitment. I think it's important to have local teams doing that work. Second one would be fly away from a compliance-only perspective, like the worker signing a declaration or having clauses in your service agreement. If you think that it makes you cover, no, it doesn't work. Which leads me to the third point, which is, I mean, as the saying goes, hope for the best, plan for the worst. In certain recruitment corridors, I would just say don't hope for anything and just plan for the worst. And get prepared, anticipate. I think I think it's a lot easier and cheaper than having to sort of repair the damage by having overlooked the issue first. Really feel competent into answering the question from the audience.
So how do we incentivize suppliers, sort of?
Employee.
How do we incentivize them to care about employees?
To care about also employees.
And the employer pays.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like to take into account both.
I think we need more like really good case studies of suppliers. Like I think obviously Sammy, Thai Union, sorry to call you out here, but that was a really good case study that you guys did. I think it was together with Impact, where it was really talking about the business benefits of the employer pays principle. And I think there were several ones that were cited in there. And I think like when we did our study looking at those increased applications to the site because of the employer pays principle. But I think the Thai Union case study also talks about some other ones like worker retention, productivity gains. So I think the more we can document these things and bring it to suppliers, it's gonna just help that conversation to happen. But I think also it can't only just be about convincing. And I think we do need to make sure that brands are making sure that people are not understanding that this is an optional thing. Like it does need to be something that is just part of doing business. is adhering to these standards that are in place for the protection of workers.
Nothing to add.
Thank you very much. And it's perfect timing because we are 1 minute out of the agenda. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.